All right, we're here with Liz Cheney, your Republican candidate for U.S. House of Representatives. Welcome, Liz.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm Brian Martin. I'm the managing editor here at the Wyoming Tribune Eagle.
I'm Sharon Fain with Black Hills Energy.
Bob Fax, Cheyenne Animal Shelter.
Again, welcome, Liz. Glad to have you here.
Great to be here.
Start with what specific issues or concerns caused you to run for Congress?
I think in large part, it's been looking at the damage that's been done to us in Wyoming over the last 8 years. And I think you can look around the country and find no state that's been hurt worse than we have been. And that's in large part because of just this massive expansion of the federal government really into every aspect of our lives. Whether you're talking about the completely overburdensome federal regulations that are making it, in some instances impossible to get access to our resources, whether you're talking about an EPA that's fundamentally out of control with things like the Clean Power Plan, Waters of the U.S., mercury and air toxic standards, or BLM, which is supposed to be managing for multiple use, but which increasingly looks like it's managing to preclude all human use of the land. So you've just got a situation where the federal government is expanded into so many areas, doing so many things it has no business doing under the Constitution. It's fundamentally harming our livelihood. It's impinging upon our rights. And it's failing to do the things we really need it to do, like defend the nation and secure our borders. And I feel very strongly that, we're really at a hinge moment here. It's a crisis. You can see it around the state in terms of the budgetary challenges we're facing, in terms of the layoffs we've seen. And we've got to make sure that we have somebody representing us in Washington who will really be able to play a leadership role in beginning to roll back these policies, and who'll be able to bring a national focus and attention to these issues. We will not be able to prevail, for example, in something like the Democrats' war on fossil fuels if we try to fight it alone. Now, we can prevail, and we have to prevail for us as a state and for our nation. But doing that requires being able to build kind of national campaigns and national coalitions that really will bring together people that can focus on these issues and build the kind of effort on our side of these issues that we've seen, unfortunately, on the other side of the issues. And I think we've got to make sure we have the strongest voice possible in Washington. So those are really the reasons that inspired me to get into the race. And I think that the big challenges that we face as a state, in particular this election cycle.
Liz, what qualifications do you bring to the table that will help you serve as an effective congressperson?
Yeah, I've got an interesting combination, I think unique, frankly, in this race, of deep roots in Wyoming. I'm a fourth generation Wyomingite on my mom's side, third generation on my dad's side. Phil and I are raising our kids here now. They're the fifth generation in our family. And it's my combination of those Wyoming roots plus experiences I've had outside the state. So, for example, when I graduated from college, I went to work in one of the most wasteful federal agencies there is. I went to work at the Agency for International Development. And immediately upon leaving that job, I wrote a paper at law school about why we've got to abolish AID. But I learned several things in that experience, one of which was that if you have a brand new member of Congress, somebody who is, has never spent any time before in a federal bureaucracy or understanding the federal bureaucracy, and that person tries to conduct oversight of the career lifelong bureaucrats, they're going to have rings run around them every single time. And it's crucially important that we have somebody who understands how those budgets work, who understands what it's going to take to fundamentally reduce the size of the federal government, and somebody who's got the experience on a national stage. As I said, we cannot, if we try to fight the war on coal, for example, and say, well, this matters just to us in Wyoming, we won't be able to prevail. What we have to have is somebody as a representative who's going to be able to, number one, educate people around the country and do that on a national stage. Number two, somebody who's going to be able to bring a national spotlight to those issues, somebody who can explain, look, if the president of the United States can target our coal industry arbitrarily without any basis in fact or science, in my view, then he can do it to any industry, and nobody is safe, and your constitutional rights aren't safe. And we need a representative who will be able to explain that these issues matter hugely across the board to everybody, every American. And I think it's my combination of experiences in terms of, my roots in Wyoming and my professional experiences, both in Wyoming and outside of Wyoming, that combine to make me a very, I think, effective voice, the most effective voice and the strongest voice for Wyoming, at this moment in our history. And I would also say that, if you look at what has to be done, and if you look at what it really takes to stand up and say, look, I believe in these conservative principles. I believe in fossil fuels. I believe in Wyoming agriculture. I believe that we ought to have the right to use our land as we see fit. You are going to get criticism from moment one you stand up and start saying those things. And again, I'm the only candidate in this race who has the experience of fighting for a principle, fighting for these ideals on a national stage, having taken the criticism, recognizing what that means, and demonstrating a willingness to stand up in the face of it. So I think those are a combination of things that are very important for us as a state right now.
Liz, what do you believe is the biggest challenge facing the nation? And once you identify the largest challenge in your mind, name one or two others as well.
I think right now it's sort of it's a fundamental assault on our freedom, but it's coming from two sources. So I think from one side you've got this absolute march, onslaught, expansion of the federal government. Beyond anything that's envisioned in the Constitution, beyond anything that's healthy or sustainable for us as a nation. And that reaches into these issues we've talked about before. It also reaches into things like Obamacare. It reaches into things like the abuses you've seen at the IRS. But fundamentally, a federal government that's out of control, a president who doesn't believe in the Constitution, who doesn't believe that he's got to be faithful to the Constitution, based on what we've seen in terms of his activities. And so you've got that one set of threats and challenges to our freedom. Simultaneously, you've got an increasing, growing, and very grave threat from radical Islam and from terrorism overseas. And that threat is particularly concerning to me because I think this is, one of the very few times in our history, and certainly, probably we're at the most heightened danger we've been at potentially since before World War II, in terms of this rising threat internationally. And you see it day after day. We've just had the attacks in Istanbul, the attacks in Paris, in Orlando, Brussels. So you've got this threat, and you've got radical Islam on the march. And at the same time, our military has just been gutted. And the president unwilling to do what's necessary to make sure they have the resources they need to defend the nation. A president who's put in place policies that have clearly resulted in weakening the nation. And it's that gap between the rising threat and our diminishing capacity to meet the threat that I think is a very grave concern. And I think those two things simultaneously, getting us back into a framework of our government where we believe again and we operate again under the notion that government that governs best governs least and closest to us, where we recognize that those authorities in the Constitution that aren't enumerated are reserved to the states, where we understand that, the federal government doesn't have a role in a lot of things like the education of our kids, for example, and sort of restoring our constitutional rights and freedoms on the one side, while at the same time ensuring that we're doing everything we need to do to defend the nation and protect our security.
Can I follow up on the radical Islam terrorism? From your perspective, why is that? Why have we gotten to the point that we have? Why is it so bad right now at this moment?
I think you have to say it's because our commander-in-chief has completely ignored the threat and diminished the threat, minimized it. Barack Obama really came into office with a set of domestic plans, domestic agenda he wanted to pursue, and the threat of radical Islam really gets in his way. And so you see him time and time again talk about, ISIS as the JV team, or after we were able to get bin Laden, which was a very good thing, then he immediately turned to saying, well, the threat from Al-Qaeda is gone. And you saw it most directly in the Benghazi attacks, and the extent to which we know now that they knew, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton knew, based on briefings they had at the time, based on reporting coming in from our facilities, that this was an Al-Qaeda linked terrorist attack on a US facility. But even though they knew that, they told this lie, which was that it was because of a video, and they did it because it was an election year. and because the president had a storyline which said that Al-Qaeda's, on its heels, Al-Qaeda's been defeated, Al-Qaeda's in retreat. So it completely destroyed his whole narrative if he would admit the reality, which is, well, actually Al-Qaeda just killed 4 Americans, an Al-Qaeda affiliated group, and, drove us out of Libya. So I think, it's very clear that when the United States is weak, when the United States is in retreat, other nations and powers try to fill the vacuum. And it tends to be, on the one hand, nations like Iran and Russia that don't have the same interests we do. And at the same time, our weakness and our retreat also opens up a void that groups like ISIS step into, and our unwillingness to do what's necessary to defeat them and take the caliphate leaves us vulnerable, and will continue to until we take the steps necessary to defeat them.
What are those steps? How do we defeat ISIS from your perspective?
Well, I think first of all, what we have to do is recognize this is a generational challenge. This is like the challenge we faced during the Cold War, where we understood that we had to fight across all fronts. At that point it was communist ideology, but we've got to fight in terms of our intelligence efforts. There's going to be a military component. There's a diplomatic component. And we have to recognize and understand the war that we're in here. And it is going to require a major effort. In terms of the military steps we have to take, I think that certainly we've got to take the caliphate away from ISIS, the land that they control in Iraq and Syria. And it doesn't require huge numbers of U.S. troops deployed, certainly, but in order to get the most effective fighting force put together and to get our allies in the region working with us, we have to demonstrate that we actually are willing to fight, and that we know this is an existential threat to the United States. And because it is an existential threat to us, we can't allow the caliphate to continue. But what we've seen right now is a president who's, unwilling to conduct any kind of a significant number of sorties, who puts rules of engagement in place so that our fighting men and women can't do what we're asking them to do, what we need them to do. And we clearly need to ramp that up. We've got to understand that as long as the caliphate exists, our enemies will have a reason and an ability to recruit. And they'll continue to do it, thousands of additional recruits per week. And they'll be able to launch the kinds of really devastating attacks we've seen, and God forbid, potentially even worse ones.
Liz, one of the public's biggest complaints about our national political process is that everything's too partisan in DC and nothing's getting done. What's your perspective on that, and how would you help bridge that gap between the two parties, work across the aisle and get things done for Wyoming?
Yeah, I think several things. First of all, you've got to understand where you're going to draw the line. I think that's very important. You have to be willing to negotiate from a position of strength and know exactly which steps you won't take, where you won't compromise on principle, for example. You also have to have a level of comfort and confidence with your own beliefs, so that you can sit across the table from somebody who might not agree with you, but you can lay out for them, look, this is why we believe that the BLM has been so devastating to Wyoming. When you have an organization like the BLM that is now launched on this effort, this Planning 2.0, reform to its land use management plans, that will in fact bring in foreign NGOs to sit at the table and have the same voice at the table that those in our local communities do. That is wrong, and that's not partisan, but it's fundamentally damaging, not just to Wyoming, but to anybody who cares about American sovereignty. And being willing to lay out, I've found that if you can get away from sort of the stereotypes and the name calling, and say to somebody, this is why I believe these things, then you may not agree, and in many instances you won't, and you'll be in a situation where they say, well, I don't agree with you on that, and you say, that's fine, we don't agree on it. But you have to be able to explain the reasoning behind your beliefs, and you have to know what you're trying to accomplish. And I would say it is not a goal in and of itself to have agreement across party lines. You have to ask yourself, why are you trying to reach that agreement? And in my view, the reason that you try to reach that agreement is when it serves the interests of Wyoming. But in some instances, what serves the interests of Wyoming is standing very firm. And not being willing to compromise on things that are fundamentally important. But I see too many instances, and certainly if you would talk to Democrats now, even in Washington, they would say, well, President Obama doesn't talk to us either. I mean, he does not really believe in working with Congress, period. And so, a lot of the atmosphere and the mood in Washington, comes out of the presidency and whether or not there are abuses going on. But, being a person of your word and being willing to sit down and explain why you believe things and have an agenda that is one that serves the people of Wyoming so that you can get things done in their behalf. I think those are very important things.
How important, from your perspective, is it to not be caught up in the DC system or Potomac fever, as some people call it, or this idea of you get there and you want to go in and represent Wyoming the best you can, but then you get caught up in the process and the fundraising and everything that is part of DC.
Look, I think it's hugely important. And, one thing the people of Wyoming can know for sure is that I've seen that up close and it has no appeal for me. And, I'm not going to go to Washington and get stars in my eyes. I've seen it. But it can be very overwhelming. And I've seen that happen to people where you get to Washington and they suddenly think, wow, if I stand up and say this, the Washington Post is going to criticize me. Or, the leadership in my party is telling me I need to do X, Y, and Z, and maybe I should because, I'm new and I don't know. And I think it's really important for our representatives to know who they're working for and who they represent and why they're there. I've had too many experiences where I've listened to members of Congress, for example, and I'm not talking about our delegation, say things like, well, we can't challenge the president on this aspect of Obamacare because he's just too good on television. He's too eloquent. It'll end up that we'll be blamed. And my view of that is, well, then you shouldn't be in Washington. The reason that you're in Washington representing your constituents is because you believe strongly in what's best for our state and what's best for our country. And you're going to go fight for that. And there's absolutely no reason to have your head swayed or turned by trappings or anything else. And that's not why I'm in this race. And that's certainly not the kind of representative I would be.
You addressed it briefly, the next question, but I want to ask it anyway. How important is it for you to maintain your own voice and your own priorities and not just vote either the way party leaders want you to vote or big donors to campaign or any of that? How important is it?
It's hugely important. And I would even go one step further to say that because Wyoming only has one voice, we can't just have somebody who's going to vote or someone who's going to sit in the seat. We have to have a leader. And so I view my responsibility, if I'm honored to be elected, not just to be the strongest voice possible for Wyoming, but to make sure that I'm educating everybody else and bringing other people along as well so they understand, to go back again, for example, to coal. I ought to be in a position where, I can go to a representative, from some community anywhere around this country who may not share any ideological affinity with my views. But I can sit down and say, look, this is what's going to happen to your constituents if the Obama Clean Power Plan is allowed to be revived, if it stays in force. This is what's going to happen to your constituents if coal dies. And make sure that it isn't just that I'm there as one person representing Wyoming, but that I'm explaining to other people why the issues that matter to us are fundamental constitutional issues. And they're fundamental issues that go right to the heart of the security of the nation, of the health of our economy, and of our constitutional freedoms and liberties. And I think that's how you be the most effective representative possible.
Liz, we have a variety of issues. We just want to kind of go through and get your take on those. Okay, so kind of a laundry list, but we'll start with military spending, and as that relates to protecting F.E. Warren Air Force Base, obviously that's important to our voters here. But where are you at? I've heard you speak a little today already about gutting the military, but how has it been gutted, and what would your priorities be on military spending?
Yeah, well, first in general, what I would say is the Congress has abdicated its responsibilities, and the military today is facing two huge challenges. One comes from the president and his policies and his desire not to provide the necessary resources. But the other comes from sequestration. And the fact that you had members of Congress several years ago basically say, look, if we can't reach agreement on this budget deal, we're going to have this set of very draconian cuts over here that are going to come into play. And the idea was those cuts were so horrific and would be so damaging that it would encourage the members to reach agreement. Well, of course, they didn't. And to me, that's a huge abdication of responsibility. That's their job. But so the cuts came in. And what that means is, for example, even though the Defense Department, the military budget only accounts for 17% of our overall budget, it's absorbing 50% of these cuts. And secondly, what it means is what you want to have is a situation where your Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs are able to sit down and say, what are the threats that face the nation and what do we need to meet those threats? And then propose a budget up against those needs. And that sort of budgeting has not gone on since at least 2011 because of sequestration. So we're in, a really almost unimaginably dire set of circumstances where, for example, in addition to, all of the stories that you hear about, the Army is about to be the smallest that it's been since before World War II, and the Air Force is the smallest and oldest fleet of aircraft we've ever had. You hear the same about the other services. You also have a situation where we risk losing our superiority. And, since World War II, it hasn't mattered whether the president was a Republican or Democrat. They've all understood the United States has to maintain military superiority. And today you've got, for example, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs expressing real concern that we're losing out on cybersecurity. In at least, that one area where we may not have superiority. So I think we've got to end sequestration and get back to a normal kind of a budgeting process. We've got to stop the federal government from doing, all the things we talked about that it shouldn't be doing, reduce its size, reduce the workforce, slash some of those agencies so that we can devote the resources we need to the military. And with respect to Warren Air Force Base, I feel very strongly that the nuclear triad, of which Warren is a key part, is fundamental to our security. And when I look at what's happening in the White House today, I think there's a sense that somehow, our strategic forces are outdated, that the nuclear triad is no longer necessary, and that's just wrong. And you begin to see sort of suggestions that the president is now going to suddenly change our nuclear policy. So we're not going to anymore have to be ready to, for example, launch on warning. It's been suggested he'll do away with our first strike capability, all of which are sort of, number one, dangerous for us as a nation, and number two, code for cutting, what insufficient modernization spending still exists for places like Warren. And I think that we have to make sure that doesn't happen. And we have to make sure that, again, Wyoming's got a representative who can explain to people why our nuclear forces are not outmoded and aren't outdated, but they're a crucial part of how we secure the nation. And, one example of this is if you look around the Middle East today, the Iranian nuclear agreement has opened up a gateway for the Iranians to get a nuclear weapon. And a number of countries in the region who used to rely on us, the United Arab Emirates, for example, and others who for, decades understood they didn't need their own nuclear weapons because we told them they could rely on our nuclear umbrella. They don't believe us anymore. And they say both, well, your nuclear forces are aging and you're not modernizing. And secondly, our worst enemy in the region, the Iranians, are basically on the verge of getting a weapon. And so when our forces are not healthy enough, strong enough, modern enough to provide the kind of comfort other nations need, you wind up with the potential for more nuclear proliferation in a much more dangerous world. So I think Wyoming's representative has to be able to make the case for Warren and the case for, the role that our forces here play in terms of our overall security.
And Liz, on any of these issues, if you feel you've already touched on them, feel free to move on, but the next one's about climate change, environmental threats, and EPA overreach, which you've addressed to some extent. But maybe talk to us a little more about climate change and environmental threats and how the country should or is addressing those properly or improperly.
Well, look, I believe that the jury is out in terms of whether climate change is caused by human activity. And I think that there has been a lot of effort to try to prove that it is. And in fact, the science just isn't there. Now, on top of that, what has happened is, so you've got this, what I would call junk science about carbon dioxide causing global warming. But the administration has taken that and is trying to destroy the fossil fuel industry. And when you ask them about it, when you've had, the EPA administrator testify before Congress, and members of Congress have said to her, well, exactly what are you going to get out of the Clean Power Plan? Exactly what improvement are you planning to see in global temperatures, if that's your concern, because of killing the U.S. coal industry? And she doesn't have an answer. Her answer is, well, this is a demonstration effect. So, I think what the administration's doing, if they really were as concerned as they say they are about, the notion that somehow a concentration of carbon dioxide is causing global warming, then they would be going after China, they would be going after India. They aren't doing that. And I think that they don't know how to do it. I think they can't figure it out. And so instead, what they're doing is, killing our industry, and doing so in a way that's fundamentally unconstitutional, and in a way that, is absolutely has no basis, as I said, in science, has no basis in terms of what our nation needs. If you look at their view of the future, it sort of seems to be that we're going to run on renewables, but they've never been able to explain how you get from here to there. How do we go from where we are today to an economy that runs on renewables? And they can't explain it because you can't do it. And if you would, stop the government subsidies to renewables, as we absolutely need to do, you'd see pretty quickly that that's not a sustainable path. I think we need to be in a position where we're recognizing the tremendous strides that have been made in terms of clean coal technology, the tremendous strides that we've made. I mean, these natural resources are a national treasure. They very much can lead the way towards energy independence, towards an economic renaissance. And we've got to have people representing us who are able to carry that case and able to say, I absolutely stand up proudly on behalf of fossil fuels. I know that it is affordable energy that's built this nation and that will continue to build our nation and that will allow our economy to grow. And we won't be cowed by people who sort of say, oh gosh, you're denying climate change. You got to show me the evidence. And so far, I haven't seen the evidence that there's, any connection at all between human activity and temperatures. And for the administration to use, what seems to be this, almost a religion on their behalf, to target an industry. And it's an industry, we talk a lot about the economy, but if you think about America's enemies, they would love to see a power grid that's not very reliable. And that's exactly what our own president is doing right now by saying he's going to take, coal offline, force these renewable energy standards, not just, on utilities around the nation, but he's forcing them on our military at a time when we're at war and when our military can't afford right now to fight the war we need them to fight. They're going to have to, they already are on the hook for these new renewable energy standards. And you hear stories about, our men and women on the front lines trying to haul wind turbines, down mountain roads in Afghanistan to forward operating bases. It's crazy. And I think that's, we've got to inject common sense into this, but we have got to make sure we have an absolute advocate on behalf of fossil fuels.
Talk to us about Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act and healthcare coverage. What needs to be done? Full repeal, revision, and how would you, or is it important to guarantee healthcare coverage for all Americans?
Well, I think we have to have full repeal of Obamacare. There's no question. The predictions that those of us made about how bad it would be, it's been even worse if that's possible. And we haven't seen some of the hardest hitting taxes and costs. Those are all scheduled to hit beginning next year. But, people have seen premiums go up. They've seen the quality of care go down. They've been kicked off their policies. They've been denied the ability to see their doctors. It's been a disaster, and we have to repeal it. It also kills jobs. I mean, every single week, as I've been out on the trail campaigning, you meet new people who talk about the fact that they either had to lay folks off, or they're not able to expand, or they can't provide the coverage that's required if they, get above the certain limit of employees. So I think it has to be repealed. And I think one really important piece of this is Congress has to live under the laws that they pass. And with respect to Obamacare, we saw a move, a year and a half ago or so by U.S. senators, Republicans and Democrats. They filed a submission with the Department of Health and Human Services saying the Senate has fewer than 50 employees, so they don't have to be covered by Obamacare. Now, that's a fraud, and it's absolutely wrong. If you're going to be part of passing laws like that, then you have to live under them. And for the Senate to, find some way to weasel out, I think it's understandable that people are furious about that. In terms of what we need to do to replace it, I think that, we've got to have a situation where people can buy their insurance across state lines and let the market create the kind of competition that really will provide the best quality of care at the best price for people, where you can choose your own plan, you can choose your own policy, you can pick what you need to be covered. You don't have the government mandating it, and you can buy it anywhere around the country. So the insurance companies have to compete with each other. And, this is another area where you've had both Republicans and Democrats protect the insurance companies. And I think that's flat wrong. I think that you've got to put the people in the driver's seat and the patients, the individuals, and force those insurance companies to compete for our business. I think it's really important also that we have tort reform. I think when you look at healthcare costs, malpractice insurance for physicians is through the roof and is one of the leading drivers. And we ought to have tort reform across the board so that our physicians aren't faced with just the complete out of control lawsuits we see now. I also think we need portability. If you look at our economy in Wyoming and you look at what we've seen happen here in terms of layoffs over the last 2 years, for a family to be facing the heartbreak of losing a job and then also turn around and have that mean, well, you don't get your health care anymore, or you get it for a limited amount of time, is wrong. And we need to find ways that we can help make it portable. But I think all of those things would go a long way towards fixing the damage that's been done.
Could you please discuss tort reform a little more from the federal level?
Yeah. Well, I think we've seen it on a state level be very effective in places like Texas. They've done a good job at it. And I think that, I would be very happy to see legislation passed at a federal level that caps awards, that caps judgment, that puts more restrictions in place in terms of what's feasible and what's not feasible. And, I think that, again, you do get powerful interests to oppose it. And in the case of tort reform, you get the trial lawyers who oppose it. And, I just think that's wrong. I think you've got to be in a position where you're saying, look, this cannot be about how can we drive physicians out of practice? How can we make it that, for a while in Wyoming, and this was probably 15 years ago or so, we didn't have a single obstetrician who was, delivering babies in the state for a while because of the malpractice we were facing. So I think that, it's the kind of issue that we ought to see dealt with both at a state level and at a national level.
You know how close we came in Wyoming several years ago.
I know, and it's too bad that we didn't get it done, and I'm surprised that we didn't get it done. But I think it's something we have to understand and admit. It's a very important part of the mix.
Liz, can you talk to us about education reforms and the move away from the No Child Left Behind law to ESSA, and what more you think needs to be done? Yeah, the place that I see several things. One, we have to get the federal government out of education. You can look at the timeline from when the Department of Education was established and track our kids' test scores against that same timeline, and it does not help our kids. If anything, it's gotten worse. And I'm fundamentally opposed to Common Core. I see it as a mom with kids in Wyoming public schools. I've got, a third grader and a fifth grader who were learning under Common Core for the first time, fully this year, because in our county, it was adopted fully this year. And it is a disaster.
And my fifth grader came home and told me that in their language arts class, they'd been studying that day, the reading was the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And, I sort of said, okay. Well, and then the next step is, and we discussed at length how it's the UN Declaration on Human Rights that guarantees our rights as Americans. Now, that's not okay and fundamentally wrong. And I was just over in Park County last week, and it is amazing to me what's going on there, but it isn't just there. Common Core has these textbooks that are called Journeys, the Journeys readers. And if you think about, what is the most miraculous and fundamental revolutionary notion at the heart of our founding as a nation, it's the idea that our rights are inalienable. It's the notion that they're from God, they're from the Creator, and that, we institute government to protect our rights. Well, these Journeys books, and they showed me the passages, these Journeys books that they're adopting in the Park County schools because of Common Core say that citizens' rights come from the government. And when parents in the community raised concerns, they were basically told, well, this is just for fourth graders. So it's kind of your notion is too sophisticated for them. And I think that is appalling. I think the idea that, we would take, what was really nothing short of miraculous, to found a nation based on inalienable rights and, to have a constitution that guarantees our rights, that the power and the rights are with the citizens, not with the government. And we would take that and just either, not even just dismiss it in these textbooks, but totally flip it around so that we're teaching our kids that their rights come from the government. I mean, it is a complete undermining of who we are as a nation. And that is, the latest example of what I believe is just the absolute, poison of Common Core. And I really believe we've got to repeal it. And I think we have to get back to local community. I'd like to see charter schools. I think those are very important. I think that we need to have vouchers for kids whose parents can't afford to send them to charter schools. I think that we need to be in a position where there's competition in our education system so that our kids are, able to really have the access to the best and the brightest and be challenged. We've got to fundamentally rethink testing. When our kids are spending the numbers of hours that they're spending on useless tests, there's something fundamentally wrong. I don't have any problem with, you teach a kid something and then you test them. That's important. But when they have these standardized tests that they're taking, bi-monthly in some instances, it's just taking time away from learning. And, you fundamentally skewed what it is you're supposed to be doing in the classroom. And I believe strongly we've got to get back to teaching American history. And we do a good job in Wyoming in fourth grade of Wyoming history. I think that's terrific. And I think most kids around the state get a really good grounding in that. And that's something that we ought to be really proud of. We have amazing teachers in this state. And we ought to, let those teachers do their job instead of imposing on them, these burdensome curricula and standards that come from outside of our state.
Liz, how important is reducing the federal deficit and dealing with the federal debt, and what are your solutions?
Yeah, it's very important. I think you've heard it described as a national security threat, and I think it is. I think that what we've got to be in a position to do, first of all, is get the economy growing again. I don't believe that you address issues like our debt and our deficit through raising taxes. I think that's exactly the wrong thing to do. We have to adopt policies that get the economy growing, that, I'd like to see taxes reduced. I'd like to see our tax system simplified. People ought to be able to keep more of their own money and invest it the way that they see fit. We've got to get costs under control in the government. And it goes back to what we were talking about before in terms of a government that's doing so many things that it has no business doing at our expense. And regulation is a huge part of this. And when you look at the explosion of regulation and you look at the extent to which, in this administration in particular, even though by law agencies are supposed to consider cost, they don't. And Congress is, again, in a lot of ways abdicated its responsibility over those agencies. And I think we've got to take that authority back. I think we need to sunset regulations. And I'd like to see legislation that makes clear that any new regulation has to have the least impact possible on the economy. I think that, it's a hidden cost that we don't see, but it's not hidden for the people that have to deal with it on a daily basis in small businesses around the country. We've got to get spending under control. I think that when you look across the board at, the way that Congress dealt with things like the Budget Control Act, it seemed like a good idea, but it's been devastating for the military. And Congress has to do its job to be able to be responsible fiscally about spending. I think that we ought to have zero-based budgeting. When you look at these federal agencies, you see at the end of every fiscal year, and that, talked earlier about AID, but you see they just start shoving money out the door because they know if they don't, they won't get the same amount next year. And that is not the way that we ought to be spending taxpayer dollars. Agencies ought to have to defend what they need every single year, not just think, well, okay, we're going to be where we were last year, so let's get this money spent or it'll get counted against us. I think also we've got to look for ways to deal with entitlement reform. And I think it's a huge challenge. I think that we have to make sure that people who are at or near retirement know they're going to be okay. We're not going to pull the rug out from under people or change programs that they've counted on. But, if you're 50 or younger, or probably older than that or younger, you've got to think to yourself whether or not those programs will be there. And we've watched this president, for example, consistently steal money out of the Social Security fund in order to pay for Obamacare. We've watched government roles expand in ways that end up providing services for people who probably don't need them at the expense of people who probably do. And I think we have to get back to a view of government that the objective of our programs, and I'm not talking about Social Security, I'm not talking about Medicare, but the objective of our programs for people who are younger is to get them off of the roles of government to the extent that they're on them. This president seems to think, the best thing he can do is expand the roles of government. It also seems to be how he thinks you create jobs is by hiring people in the federal government. And that's just fundamentally wrong. We know it doesn't work.
Liz, can you talk about endangered species and the ESA and how that's impacted Wyoming and how you would change that?
Yeah, I think the Endangered Species Act probably needs to be repealed, certainly significantly reformed. You've got a situation today where any human use of our land is valued less than any other use of our land. And in situations, where, for example, if you look at the sage grouse, which, obviously we tried to prevent it from being listed by imposing our own plan here, adopting our own plan here. And even though we did that, the BLM still has a role. The BLM still comes in. They still find a way in. And fundamentally, an act, and I think I would say the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, a number of these pieces of legislation were passed with, understandable intent, but they've been totally abused and exploited by radical environmentalists. And when you have a situation where, you get one liberal federal judge who says, well, Wyoming's wolf plan is insufficient, for example, that's wrong. That's not how the system ought to work. We ought to recognize and understand that, we in Wyoming are the best stewards of our land, that our farmers and ranchers are the best stewards of this land, that our energy industry is a tremendous steward of our land. And when you have this total hypocrisy where, if you're operating in the oil and gas industry and you kill a bird of prey, you're immediately fined, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. Whereas if you're operating a wind farm, you can kill something like 4,200 golden eagles a year with no fine. And so there's this real hypocrisy at the center of how we're trying to protect our species and how we're operating. And I think it's got to be fundamentally reformed. And I think, again, this gets back to a federal government that is operating so far away from us and with such arbitrary power. You see it in examples like the, EPA showing up at the door of the rancher in Worland and telling him that he owes, 5 years retroactively, $37,500 a day. It's the same kind of case that you saw with Andy Johnson. Now, in this instance, this gentleman fought it and won. But anytime a government agency can impose those kinds of ruinous fines or arbitrary rules or drive human beings off of the land, in the name of protecting a species that is, not endangered and not threatened by the activity that we're undertaking on the land. I just believe that humans matter more than anything else. And that, we've got to have a system in place that protects our wilderness in terms of the beautiful lands that we have here in Wyoming, but not at the expense of, driving human beings off the land.
Liz, talk to us about the importance of air service in Wyoming and the federal government's role in ensuring funding for small airports. What is that role, and to what extent should that funding be coming from the feds?
Yeah, I think that air service is very important to our economy. I think the federal government, again, has been playing, a negative role in terms of the kinds of restrictions and rules that they put on pilot flight hours that may make sense in some larger markets, but don't make sense for us here. I think that, we'd like to see air service expanded. And I think that it is a place where, I think the federal government has a role to play because it's air service, but I'd like to see that role be one that's much more constructive than the one that we've seen to date.
We're asking all the candidates for their feelings about the presidential nominees or the apparent nominees for both parties, and then specifically for your party. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think Hillary Clinton is a felon. I think, and I don't say that lightly, but, I know what it means to have a security clearance. I've had them for many years. I know the kinds of oaths that you take when you get a clearance. I know the kinds of briefings that you receive in terms of the danger and the damage that can be done if you reveal classified material. And there's just no question, you can't be in a position like, be the Secretary of State and decide that you're going to conduct all your business on an unsecured server and think in any way, shape, or form that that's going to be secure, or that you're going to be protecting the national security information of the nation. And we've seen now emails where she's instructing her staff to remove classification markings before they email her things, because they say to her, hey, we can't get this to you because it's classified. And she told them just remove the markings. So there's no question but that she's clearly violated the law. And I think when you combine the lack of care and the lack of belief that the law applied to her, that she showed with the email scandal, with what she did in Benghazi. And in Benghazi, she, number one, failed to provide the security that was requested before the attack. Number two, totally incapable, unwilling, unable to provide any sort of the support that was requested while the attack was going on. And then number three, lied to the American people afterwards about it. And, it seems to me that we just don't need any more evidence that she's totally unfit to be our commander-in-chief. She would absolutely continue the policies of the Obama administration. She said she wants to put the coal industry out of work. And in the next breath, in that same appearance, she said, and then we're going to move on to oil and gas. I think she probably would try to move to a single-payer health system, going exactly in the wrong direction. And you've just seen this history on the part of the Clintons where they really don't think the law applies to them. And that is a very dangerous thing to have somebody sitting in the White House who doesn't think the law applies to her. And it became much more than just sort of a political criticism when we saw what she did with the email. So I think she's totally unfit to be president of the United States. And I think that on the Republican side, we had a really healthy and well thought out primary with 17 candidates. I had not endorsed anybody in the primary. And I think now it's absolutely clear Donald Trump is our nominee. And I think it's really important that we unite behind him to make sure that we don't end up with Hillary Clinton in the White House.
Expand on your specific feelings about Mr. Trump and his policies, or where he would be strong or where he might be weak.
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, the fact that you've seen more votes for him in a Republican primary than any other Republican candidate in history is a very positive thing. And I think it tells you that people are totally frustrated and scared and angry, but they aren't taking that as a reason to check out of the system or the process. I think that you saw, certainly here in Wyoming, many more people at most of our county conventions than we've had in past years. And in a lot of instances, and I understand this, a real frustration, frankly, with our system in Wyoming, people feeling like, wait a minute, I showed up, but I didn't get to have a voice. And I think that's why you're seeing movements now here, for example, people suggesting we ought to move to a primary process, which I think is a really interesting idea. We have to have a system that gives as many people as possible, the chance to participate and make their voice heard. So I think that's a very positive thing. I think that there are certainly areas where I don't agree with him. And I think that, if you begin to look at some of the people he's brought around him, on the national security side of things, for example, people like Zal Khalilzad, Waleed Faris, both of whom are gentlemen I know who really understand the threat we face. And I've been glad to see them advising Trump. I think in terms of trade, I think he's put his finger on something very important. I think that people have, for too long, particularly in the last 8 years, we have not had a single person representing us at the executive branch who understood a whit how to negotiate. And, if you wanted to sort of say, how can you guarantee the worst possible outcome for America? We'll put John Kerry across the table from the Iranians. I mean, we do not have anybody who really understands how to negotiate. And I think we all believe, and I certainly believe in free trade. I think it's hugely important for our economy. But it's got to be trade that doesn't kill American jobs. And it's got to be trade that really is fair. And, you can't just end up with, the Obama administration negotiator and the foreign government negotiator, and everybody's doing everything they can to get to a deal regardless of the deal. We have to make sure that we're negotiating the best deals possible for our citizens and for our jobs. I also think that, Trump on immigration has done more than anybody else to point out the flaws of our current system, to point out the danger of our current system, to point out the extent to which, if we know we have an enemy trying to destroy us, and we know that enemy has said publicly that they're going to infiltrate refugee flows, then we better not be opening our doors and letting refugees come in. That doesn't mean we don't help refugees. It doesn't mean we impose a religious test. It means that we do everything we can to help support people in their home countries. And it means that we destroy ISIS and the caliphate so that the refugee flows will stop. But you cannot, operate the way that Hillary Clinton wants us to, which is the borders are totally open and we're not going to enforce our laws and we're going to have sanctuary cities. And people are going to get some kind of a path to amnesty or citizenship. That's just, fundamentally our sovereignty and our security require something different.
Liz, the last question I have, and you may have already addressed this, but again, the question is, what do you believe are the priorities for Wyoming's lone member of the House? And then how do you make sure that Wyoming's voice is heard among 435 in that body?
Well, I think absolutely the priorities have to be to help Wyoming recover from the last 8 years, to get our energy industry back on its feet again, to help our ag producers get out from under the overwhelming regulation that we've seen from these agencies, to help our small businesses grow again. To do those things, one of the ways I think about it is if you think about who the president is going to be in 2017, and if we're going to have a President Trump, which is one option, Wyoming's representative has to be able to get the attention of President Trump, to get the attention of the executive branch, to be able to say, while you're moving immediately on these national security challenges, which you have to move on immediately as soon as you take office, you also have to move immediately to deal with the EPA and to repeal the Clean Power Plan. And, let's pass legislation that says you can't regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant, and let's stop Planning 2.0. You have to move immediately on these issues that may not have been on your radar screen, but they have to be because they're fundamental issues that deal with our rights and freedoms. And that will require, being more than just one of 435. It'll require being able to make sure our voice is heard. If Hillary Clinton is in the White House in January 2017, then Wyoming has to have somebody who is going to be the strongest fighter possible to stop the damage she's going to try to do, and somebody who can motivate others, somebody who can lead others in the Congress on Wyoming's behalf, so that we can make sure we don't have to endure 4 more years of the kind of devastation we've seen under this president.
Liz, I want to give you an opportunity to address any issues or give us any thoughts that were not related to the questions we asked.
I think the couple of other things that we didn't mention, Second Amendment rights, which again are hugely important. I think that you've seen now a court that is split 4-4 on some key issues and failed to uphold rights, particularly when it came to the abortion case last week. And the presidential election will be hugely important in terms of making sure elect Hillary and don't give her the opportunity to appoint judges who don't understand that the Second Amendment right is an individual right to keep and bear arms. A lot of times you hear people sort of saying, well, we have to protect our sportsmen and hunters' rights, and that's true, but the Second Amendment's about self-defense, and it's about, you know, who we are as a nation. And I think it's very important that we not go down a slippery slope or elect somebody who might be tempted to go down a slippery slope in terms of restrictions on our Second Amendment right. I would also mention our First Amendment rights. I think that when you look at things like Obamacare, you look at the Little Sisters of the Poor case, where, you know, citizens are being asked to fundamentally violate their conscience, their freedom of conscience. When you look at things like the religious test that's being imposed on Judge Neely right now, that's wrong. You know, our Constitution says there shall be no religious tests. And I think we're entering into an era where it's going to be very important to make sure that we're defending and protecting our First Amendment rights as they apply across the board, including to freedom of conscience and freedom of religion.
Anything else?
Just wonderful to be back in Cheyenne, wonderful to be here with you guys, and I appreciate very much the opportunity, and look forward to the rest of the days now till the primary, but it's a hugely important election, and be honored obviously to have the support and the votes of the people of Wyoming as we enter into this really important period for our state.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.